All right, g'day IB psychologists. IB Health Psychology continued. We're looking at ACEs, and while it sounds like a positive thing, it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. These have gathered a lot of attention lately in the research and in the media about how these are correlated with health problems, mental and physical. So we're going to look at how and why ACEs influence stress, and why if you've got more adverse childhood experiences, you might be more at risk for having high levels of stress, chronic stress, and stress-related problems. So one thing to note, and importantly, is that the ACEs can increase amygdala reactivity. This has been found in research. And why is that an issue? Well, remember that the amygdala is the part of the brain that sends a signal to the hypothalamus to activate the HPA axis. And so a common finding, for example, in people with PTSD is that they have a hyperresponsive amygdala. Their amygdala is on red alert, and so it's constantly looking for threats and fears in the environment. And we're going to look at this. This makes perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective. If you are a child and you're growing up in an environment filled with potentially dangerous, traumatic things happening around you, well, it makes perfect sense for your amygdala to be on red alert, being hyper-vigilant, looking for those threats and activating the stress response. So you're constantly ready to fight or flight. That's what the stress response is. So, but the problem is that when this persists in the long term, it's always the chronic stress we're looking at, the chronic activation of the stress response is where you get all sorts of health and physical health and mental health problems. And so McCrory, 10 years ago, back in 2011, they conducted this study on London children, and they had two groups of London kids, and they had one group who were exposed to violence, and this was, emotional violence, abuse, things like this. And they found this sample by going to the social workers and asking for volunteers and getting family permission and consent. But they needed a control group to compare this to. So they also found a matched group of 23 children who were matched with the violence exposure group on their gender, IQ, their handiness, and their age. And then they put them in an fMRI machine, and using pretty common standard techniques in the fMRI, they show them a bunch of faces, right? Angry, sad, neutral. And while they're in the fMRI, they would show an angry and a sad, and they would have to select, okay, which one is the angry, which one's the sad. So not just passively looking at the faces, but that task is just designed to get them to actively engage, right, in looking at the faces. Now, what they found was that when shown the angry face, and this is a image from the original study, when shown angry faces, the activation in their right amygdala was higher, but not sad faces with neutral. So we're looking at angry to neutral compared to sad to neutral. So it's not the type of face is important here, because it's not just the fact that they were reacting more to faces or negative emotion, because sadness is a negative emotion. It was particularly a threatening emotion, right? An angry face. And so I don't know enough about the difference between the right amygdala and the left amygdala, to be honest, or even if there is a significant difference between the left and the right in terms of why one side would be more reactive than the other. But nevertheless, the results showed that it was in the right amygdala that the kids, when they saw the angry faces, it was more activated. And what does this suggest? It suggests that they are more responsive to threats. Their amygdala has been programmed to, and because this is an example of neuroplasticity. Their amygdala has been programmed to be hyper vigilant and responsive to threats in their environment, so they are ready to fight or brace themselves or to protect themselves, right, in case they are exposed to violence. Remember, they've grown up surrounded by violence. What this suggests is that this hyperresponsive amygdala and the continual activation of the stress response is a neurological risk factor for stress, chronic stress, and other health-related problems. This could provide us with an explanation as to why people who have higher ACE scores, more traumatic childhoods, are more at risk for physical and mental health problems down the line, because of their constant activation of the stress response due to their hyperresponsive amygdala. All right, so hopefully that gives you a really good explanation of how and why ACEs influence stress. Now, how can you use this in the exams for IB? Well, you can see that ACEs are a risk factor. High ACE scores is a risk factor. A low ACE score could be a protective factor. This provides you with a social cultural explanation of high stress, because ACEs are a social factor, but it can also give you an example of the biopsychosocial model and the biological, because here we're looking at it's not just one factor, it's the combination between the social factors and the biological factors. So I really like this example, and McCrory's study, while my heart bleeds for the children, for our purposes in the IB psychology, it's a valuable study because it gives us that insight into how traumatic childhoods can influence our behavior down the line. Now, if you're following along this lesson in the stress unit, if you're doing it in the workbook and you're following the lesson plan with your teacher in the slides, hopefully you've been introduced to David Goggins, a fantastically inspirational man who can show you that, yeah, sure, you can have traumatic childhoods, but you can use it as fuel and you can embrace it to fuel your success in the future. And it's all depending on how you think about it. So if you now, by the way, remember that most people have at least one ACE. I think I have 2 or 3. It's 70% or higher will have at least one ACE, because divorce is is the most common one. But so it's very few people go through life with 0 ACEs, right? Anyway, that is for that lesson. Now, remember, if you prefer to listen to audiobooks, the audiobook for the Stress the Student's Guide, all this content is included in the audiobook. You can listen along to it as you read, or just listen along to it by yourself. And all of this information is included in our bundle pack. So if you're a student, you might want to send this on to your teacher, or if you're a teacher, download it in the description. Our blog is always being updated, as is our store, as is this YouTube channel. I hope it's really helpful. If you enjoy this kind of thing, please leave a comment. It's really valuable for me to hear from people, to say, hey, thank you for the explanation, thank you for the studies. It motivates me to keep going. And also, I know that this is a good use of my time, because my time is getting more and more precious, so I need to choose carefully how I use it. So if you find this helpful, your comments are much appreciated. All right, coming up next, we're going to look at social support and how that can help you reduce stress.